So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Festival of Teaching and Learning. My name is Krista McNutt. I'm the Open Education Lead for the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I'm a member of the steering committee for the festival. Just to start us off first, the University of Alberta Center for Teaching and Learning acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Before I introduce the presenter today, I'd like to note that we have a Google form that we'll be putting in the chat for you just to submit some questions to the presenters. And then at the end, we will have a feedback form at the end as well. The questions that we'll be submitting in the form throughout the presentation will help us organize the questions as they come in. So please feel free to click that and share throughout the whole session. And today I'd like to introduce you to Andrea Korda. So Andrea is an associate professor in art history, fine arts, and humanities in the Augustana faculty. Over to you, Andrea.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today. And a special thanks as well to the festival organizers. So today I'm going to be talking about curating course materials by using open educational resources. So my plan for today, just a bit of an overview first. I'm going to begin by discussing what I mean by open educational resources and curating course materials. And I'll talk about how my understanding of these two concepts shifted while teaching online over the past year. Next, I'm going to talk about OERs that I created this year. I actually worked on two, and they were both collaborative curatorial projects. And I'm going to talk about how those projects influenced my teaching. And finally, I'm going to highlight what I see as the advantages of this approach and talk about what I hope to retain when we return to the classroom. So before I get started, I'm just putting a bunch of different links into the chat. These are all things that I'm going to be referencing as I talk. So you can feel free to, click on those and explore as we go. Also not necessary, but they're there for you. My first slide, what are open educational resources? So I've put up here a definition offered by Open Education Alberta from their starter kit. And that is the first link that I've shared in that list. Now, open educational resources and discussions about OERs are, of course, nothing new. But the pandemic and the move to remote teaching brought this into new focus for me for a few reasons. As I talked with colleagues both at the U of A and at other institutions in Canada during the summer of 2020 about how to move forward with our remote year, we talked about how we could collaborate in new and productive ways. The pandemic created conditions that made these new things both possible and desirable. Firstly, because we had to reinvent our teaching anyway. Of course, as we all know, we often avoid doing new things because it takes more time than just doing it the way we've always done it, which often, would have already worked pretty well. Secondly, we realized that we could contribute to one another's courses in new ways as well. Once everyone would be logging on remotely through Zoom, it didn't matter where your guest was from. So, for example, I visited colleagues' classes at the University of Manitoba and Victoria, and I also collaborated with those two colleagues to design an assignment for our students. And then we recorded a conversation between us about the assignment that we shared across all three of our courses. Now, these kinds of collaborations reduced workload by sharing resources, but also made the work that we were doing to reinvent our teaching more enjoyable because it was shared and collaborative, and I got to learn from colleagues alongside my students. Now, these activities started me thinking about OERs a little bit differently. They were no longer online resources that were sort of created out there that I could search out. I started to think about OERs as collaborative teaching and learning just on a larger scale. So secondly, and I'll return to that as I talk about specific examples. So the concept of teaching is curating. I've always thought about course design and especially about the task of selecting readings for a course as a form of curating. But remote teaching had me thinking about this differently. I was no longer just curating the readings and topics that would be included in a course. I now started to think of myself as curating resources for my students on a weekly basis. So instead of spending time to film myself delivering content, I put my time into exploring and engaging with the resources that are already out there, and then selecting and framing those individual resources so that they work together to achieve course objectives. And I think in a nutshell, that is sort of what I mean by teaching as curating. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the OERs that I created this year. I actually created two, and they both grew out of efforts to create collaborative teaching materials that were then sort of scaled up in the sense that they could then be shared more broadly because they were openly accessible online. So the first one I'm going to talk about is this. This is photography. This is a virtual exhibition of photographic materials in the U of A Library's Bruce Peale Special Collections. And this was supported by a U of A OER award. And it's a collaboration with Heather Caverhill, who is here today. Hi, Heather. Heather is a PhD candidate at UBC and an instructor in art and design at the U of A. Heather and I started this project before the pandemic. The idea actually sort of started to emerge quite a few years ago. The idea arose when it became clear that bringing 100 students into special collections each term was no longer practical. And it really wasn't. But we really wanted to still use those historical photographs that were at our fingertips on the U of A campus in our teaching. So we started planning this virtual exhibition that could serve as a textbook for our courses. We spent time selecting the materials to include in this exhibition during the summer of 2019, and the project got put on hold for much of 2020. But when we came back to it again and completed the work during this past academic year, I was going to call it a pandemic year there, which is accurate as well, the whole project took on new significance, since this would have been an excellent resource for my teaching in winter 2020, when I was teaching the history of photography course online. Though the exhibition wasn't complete at that time, so I couldn't assign it in my class, I ended up using a similar model for some of my course materials. So I felt there was this really kind of interesting and sort of useful sort of feedback loop between the work on this exhibition and then my teaching. So I'm just going to click through to one page. This is the landing page for one of the subheadings in the exhibition on the topic of how do photographs circulate knowledge from 1850 to 1900. And so you can see here kind of the form that each of these subheadings takes in the exhibition. We have an overview with key ideas that can be applied to the different items that are in the exhibition. And then as you scroll down, these are the different items that are exhibited within this sort of virtual space that can help students sort of engage with those concepts and which are with our overarching question. So you can click onto each of these to get more information and learn about those individual examples. So for example, here, the anatomical illustrations of the bee. Don't worry about reading the text. I have it cut off here. I'll just flip through some of the images. This is one of my favorite examples. It's super interesting. So with the text that's there, the text helps to frame this specific item. And you'll notice that there are quite a few links here. So what we have is a combination of external links that open out onto further information that's required to understand this object. But there are also a number of internal links, and these set up comparisons sort of across the exhibition, but also when used in the context of a course, across course materials to help students engage with those key ideas. So for example, you can click onto this one and see an earlier example of objects seen through the microscope. Go back over here. So as I mentioned, this exhibition really helped to provide a model for my teaching and kind of helped me think more about how I'm going to use this exhibition moving forward in classes, whether it's online or in person. So you are definitely not meant to read the text on this screen. It's just sort of a useful visual, or I think it might be useful, to show how I structured some of my asynchronous teaching units this year. This is the course materials or the asynchronous course materials that I shared with my students for a unit on photography as a scientific instrument in the 19th century. And really, although it's far less visually interesting to look at than that exhibition, it follows a similar structure in that there is an overview that gives students sort of the key themes and guiding questions for this unit, and then followed by a number of individual items that can help students engage with these themes and questions. So what you see, what I hope you're able to see here, is just that there are quite a few links. So I've provided a lot of framing for the various resources that I am then pointing my students to. And each of those links take students to rich multimedia sources for them to explore. Now, my external sources, I was actually incredibly fortunate for this project. From that OER award from the U of A, I was able to hire a research assistant who really helped in the process of curating these resources. Just on these pages alone, we have links that take us to the Wellcome Library, the Museum of Modern Art, the Internet Archive, the Victorian Albert Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Now, aside from curating course materials, I also curated discussion in a way for my students. Students were responsible for navigating this asynchronous material on their own, though I was always available on Zoom during class time to support this work. But in order to have some two-way communication in our course without having to make synchronous attendance and participation mandatory, students were asked to fill out a Google form in response to their asynchronous coursework. They were asked to provide one or two key takeaways from the unit and then ask one or two questions. And then I used a Google Jamboard to collate their observations and questions. And here again, not necessarily meant to be able to read the text, but this is just an example of what those Jamboards looked like. And I ended up structuring our synchronous time together around those responses. And then I also recorded those so that students who could not be present in class still had, could still ask questions and hear the responses to their questions. And you'll notice here, as I said, you don't need to read the text, but you can sort of see the color coding here. I used color to sort of put together related observations and questions, and that provided the structure. And really, there were interesting discussions. I could sort of imagine if we had been all in the class together, how that discussion would have taken place. And then it was mostly me kind of modeling the discussion and bringing their responses back to them. And students could also ask questions as we went along or add notes onto the Jamboard. So I also want to just highlight a second open educational resource that I worked on this year. And this one resulted from a pandemic collaboration with two colleagues, Vanessa Warren at the University of Manitoba and Mary Elizabeth Layton at the University of Victoria. Over this past year, we organized a series of virtual roundtables and hands-on workshops on the theme of Victorian material culture. And we got a SHIRT Connection grant to fund a team of RAs who helped us create teaching resources that were based on those events. So in the end, we ended up with this wonderful website that brings together our various materials, as well as hosts our online crafting tutorials, which I'll show you in a moment. We also had a virtual exhibition called Victorian Things and a podcast called Victorian Samplings. And I've provided links to all of those in the chat. These resources offered curated materials for class sessions so that an instructor starting from a single object or crafting practice can use our selection of resources to support their teaching and their students' learning. So with this as well, I'm just going to click on, I'll go over this pretty quickly and you can explore on your own if you're interested. I'm just going to take this link over to our crafting tutorials. And these tutorials are based on hands-on workshops that we had that we hosted over Zoom. So say you want to teach hair art, which is a new thing for me this year in your classes, you can go onto this page And you can see that there is this sort of framing here, which is similar to the way that the photography's exhibition was created and my course reading guides were structured. And as you go down, there are videos and the tutorial, the instructions of how to do this. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you can click on a link to a PDF that gathers together additional resources that might be helpful in supporting students. You can also go on to our exhibition, Victorian Things, and maybe explore a hair bracelet that belonged to the Bronte family over here. Or additionally, you can go check out our podcast and see the first episode with an interview with Sandra Kloak, who's an artist who works with hair and who helped to develop that workshop. So we really saw this website, this OER, as a kind of hub for teaching and learning resources that could support crafting in the classroom. And we're planning to move forward with this in the coming year and extend the project, creating more structured lesson plans around these crafting activities. So before moving on to my conclusion, I also want to note that many instructors have been creating amazing resources over this past year in response to the move to online learning, and they've been sharing widely. 3 projects come to mind that I wanted to acknowledge as wonderful resources and as inspirations. And the first is Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom, which does have those sort of structured lesson plans, and it has videos of recording conversations between scholars and readings. Also, Linda Steer's podcast, Unboxing the Canon, which is aimed at first-year art history students. And then also Open Art Histories, a network and website dedicated to fostering OERs for art history in Canada. And I know some of these are quite discipline specific, but I've put links to these in the chat if people are interested. Okay, finally, my reflections on the conclusion. Why should we curate course materials in non-pandemic times? So I would say, during pandemic times, I think it really helped instructor. For me, it gave sort of support and collaboration during this difficult time when we were all sort of reinventing the wheel, and that was great. But moving forward, I think there are some really good reasons to continue this practice, or why I will continue this practice. So first, we heard from the festival's keynote speaker, Alex Usher, that students are going to continue to expect to have course materials available to them asynchronously. For me, curating online resources is a way to provide meaningful and rich content to students while retaining my role as a facilitator, guide, and teacher, rather than as the so-called sage on the stage or as the font of knowledge there to deliver information. Second, since this approach asks students to engage with multiple types of sources and media, there's an opportunity here to weave information literacy into all of the coursework. As I move forward with this approach, I plan to do more to call attention to the sources of the multiple resources we use within a single course unit. Third, for me, a great strength of this approach is that it puts the onus on the student to synthesize ideas and information from multiple sources. Frequently, we ask students to do this on tests and in research papers. And here they're expected to practice this important skill of integrating knowledge from multiple sources on a regular basis as part of the structure of the course, not just as part of the assessment. And that brings me to my last point here about course alignment. As a result of this, the day-to-day work of engaging with course materials is more closely aligned to modes of assessment, right? I'm asking them to sort of synthesize materials as part of their day-to-day work, and then also in the ways that I assess them. And I think that alignment is always a great thing for instructors and students. And I should just give a shout out to CTL because I took a great course on course alignment with them. I think, Cosette, you were one of the people to lead that, and it was really inspiring and useful. Okay, to conclude, as I was reflecting on my practice of curating course materials while working on this presentation, I realized that my overall point is not just that we should curate our materials, but perhaps more importantly, that we should share our resources widely So if you've created a resource that has been useful for your students, you should make sure to share it with colleagues. And if you've spent time curating a particular set of resources to create an engaging course unit, I encourage you to share that too. Thank you so much for joining me today.